Hi, I'm Kriti Shah, and this is my podcast, Have You Thought About? I'm a writer who loves to find out about what passions people are pursuing, especially if they're managing to blend together their skills in unusual ways. In each edition, I chat with someone I find particularly interesting and who's managed to fit things together in their life or profession that you might not always think of as an obvious match. Here, I'm speaking to earth scientist and the author of The Whispers of Rock, Dr Anjana Khatwa. Anjana, now I first have to tell our Have You Thought About community that I have actually reviewed your book, The Whispers of Rock, and they should go and check out a back issue of New Scientist. But the book itself is very, very special. It's your debut. How did it come about?
Well, thanks for inviting me on to talk about The Whispers of Rock. The book has come about after a lifetime of working in the geosciences and particularly in protected landscapes. And I worked at the Jurassic Coast for 15 years. It's a World Heritage Site. The rocks there are incredibly special and spectacular. Over the course of my career, I've noted how people come to beautiful places like this. They kind of sit and eat an ice cream on the beach and look at the rocks and then look out to sea. And sometimes they just leave without ever knowing the wonderful, incredible stories of the rocks that make up that landscape. And what I find really interesting and have found since COVID is that people have begun to take a greater effort to connect with the natural world. But geology very rarely figures in that. And so the book has come about as a response to that, as a response to geology not really being centered in that conversation about what is nature and what constitutes a natural world. And in the book, I really try to bring rocks centrally into that conversation through all sorts of different ways so people begin to feel a sense of connection with them.
But it's like a love letter to rocks, which sounds a little bit strange if you say it. But you've been passionate about rocks since you were a kid. I mean, lots of kids have these passing fads. I used to have a rock transformer toy. But you really developed this love of understanding the world around us in geology. Like, how did that actually come about? Not just having it as a, oh, that's cool, on to the next thing.
Yeah, I did have those moments as well. I wanted to be an astronaut and work for NASA. And then that very quickly vanished, that dream. But it was replaced with this absolute obsession with geology. And, the book is, you described the book as a love letter to rocks. And I think that's an incredibly astute observation because this is genuinely how I feel about rocks and landscape. And the journey for me started when I was a teenager. I was 13 on holiday in Kenya with my parents, which is where my family is from. And it was kind of an epiphany that I had walking across some ancient lava flows in a place known as the Savo West National Park. For a girl who's grown up on the outskirts of London, I grew up in Slough, nature, it wasn't a place or it wasn't an environment that I spent much time in because nature for our culture and our family, it lives within us. We don't necessarily feel the need to walk through the woods to be part of the natural world. It lives within us. But at the same time, I had a craving to want to be in those spaces. I did geography at school. I learned about coastlines. I learned about mountains. And my imagination was like, wouldn't that be amazing to be in those places and to experience those environments? So walking across these incredible rocks in Kenya, for me, that was an epiphany because I'd never seen anything like that. And I think this whole idea of volcanoes as being this demonstration of the way the earth expresses herself. And I was walking over rocks that were once, seas of churning lava. That really captivated my young mind. And I just went on to really want to be a person that studied the evolution and the creation of the earth. And yeah, I had lots of obstacles and lots of challenges on the way, but I think it was that moment that I fell in love with the rocks. That's what carried me through.
As you say, it's not, oh, here's a field guide to rocks. Here is how you can identify one. It's also a memoir. It provides that spirituality and science that you don't get everywhere. So how did you navigate that?
Blending together science and spiritualities is an incredibly difficult process to take because I think number one, I don't think scientists necessarily look at their content in that way. I think we are taught as scientists to be incredibly empirical. We are observers, we evaluate, we measure, we're incredibly distant from the subject matter. And I think that's necessary in order for us to be objective and in order for us to achieve the results we want to achieve, a rational explanation of how certain things happen based on a certain process that we have to follow. I think particularly when researchers are working within the natural sciences, that does create a sense of distance with the subject matter. And I think when you do create that distance, it kind of reduces your sense of empathy and feeling with rocks. I think they're already difficult to study because they require an immense amount of imagination and creativity to kind of bring them to life. Here I'm holding a rock in my hand, which is green because of the chlorite in it. That's a mineral. And on the surface of the rock are these chevron patterns. Now, this rock is from southern Norway. It was formed about 400 million years ago when two continents very slowly collided together, closing an ocean between them. And the chevron patterns are actually folds in the rock formed as the ocean sediments were squeezed and uplifted under immense heat and pressure. So to become a geologist requires an immense sense of creativity to imagine these realms, these worlds that no longer exist. And what I find remarkable is that when we look at Indigenous storytelling and traditional kind of knowledge systems, they already had that imagination. And then we're stretching back 30,000 years of storytelling. These people were living amongst the landscape, looking at the rocks as these story keepers, not only for their own lives and their own histories, but also the Earth's creation. And I think once we begin to blend that together with the science that we have objectively created in terms of our theories and our understanding, what I found through blending those two systems together was a sense of feeling and emotion, but most importantly, ethical thinking.
In terms of the response for what you've created, which, as you say, it is unusual, how has that been?
I found it really interesting. I found that I was most terrified of what the scientists would think. If I'm perfectly honest, I thought this book was going to be career ending. But actually, it's been the opposite. The scientific community have welcomed it with open arms. And I think, particularly, your review in New Scientist really stunned me because I think you got the book. You understood what I was trying to do. This is not a kind of preaching book. I hope it doesn't come across that way. It is a book built upon passion to want to help people to enter this very complex and abstract world. What's interesting is how the nature community have responded, because I think that has been a bigger struggle, if I'm being honest. I think people who write about nature and think about the natural world are still struggling to see geology as part of that. And I think because also I'm speaking about it from a lens of being a woman of color, I'm speaking about it through different types of lenses, particularly Indigenous voices, and we know that nature writing community is predominantly white. I think that's also a challenge as well, to accept that a woman of color can be an expert in her field and can speak with integrity and authenticity, but also bring in other voices who haven't necessarily been listened to in the past. They're not voiceless. Indigenous people have always had voices. It's just that the wider community hasn't taken time to listen to them. I think the fact that perhaps people within that space of the natural world and what they perceive to be nature, I think they do struggle with this different context and this different layering of knowledge systems alongside what is seen as a very traditional view of nature, which is trees and wildlife and birds and, and now rivers. Putting rocks into that context feels jarring, but I think for the rest of the world who exist in this space where rocks are incredibly reverenced and seen as an animate part of the world, the natural world, that for us is a normal state of existence. So it's been an interesting journey anyway.
I found your work quite seminal, and in fact now even my outside of rocks life, because it's not my passion, it's not my specialism, but I'm using some of the concepts that you bring up, and I'm able to use them in ways to navigate spaces which aren't easy to. One of the things that I use quite a lot, which you bring in, is that idea of disturbance. Your work is disturbing. You reference ideas around the disturbance of rocks in different spaces. Was that something you always set out to do?
Yes, I'm a disruptor. I'm a disruptor in every space that I move into. And I don't think I see myself as a harmful disruptor. I think I naturally disrupt with my own body, with my own identity, and with my voice because I work in a field. This is the geosciences, but also natural heritage and conservation. These fields are incredibly wide. And just by me existing and moving into those different spaces, I disrupt the narrative, I disrupt the sense of calmness and feeling and thought. So even by not even uttering a word or writing a word, my sense of presence is disruptive. Now, when we come into how the book begins to impact on that space and then the narratives in the book, they are very, very challenging. And I think, again, this is perhaps a really interesting outcome that I didn't quite see when the book was released, is we are at the end of 2025 and I'm looking at all of the shortlists and the books of the year. And they are, as you expect, they are by writers who fit into this current narrative of what science should be or what nature writing should be. Nothing surprises me. And I think the book itself is incredibly challenging to read because it is dealing with different voices from all over the world that I think most readers are not accustomed to hearing from, but also it deals with tragedy and loss, but also immense creativity and knowledge from cultures that have perhaps not been listened to or been heard from by the vast majority. So that in itself is quite disruptive to bring in those thinking pieces and put them alongside what is broadly acceptable, which is the Western science point of view. And that in itself is quite a disruption to say all of these knowledge systems, including from my own culture, are equitable to what we expect and we know about theories like plate tectonics. And to do that, essentially, like you say, it is a genre busting technique, it kind of laying a threshold that we can't go back on. Here we are. I have consulted with and worked with all of these communities across the world, but I've placed that knowledge system equitably along the science. And I don't think there's any way of going back now. I think we do have to move forward. People like myself do have to disrupt to trigger that movement forward.
But at what cost to you? Because the book is also quite vulnerable. You are going into spaces where you're not necessarily expected to be, and that's having to put yourself up ahead of the parapet. So how are you managing that momentum within that sort of context?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think I'll be honest, it's a very up and down process. I think the ups are when I hear feedback from readers or when I'm at events and people are coming up to me saying they feel seen. And I think that's a really interesting word because when people come up to me and say, I've never heard anybody talk about rocks like you. I feel like I felt this my whole life, and now you're saying this out in the open. I feel like I can come forward, and I'm not embarrassed anymore to say this is how I feel as well. So I think there is a certain aspect of what the book has drawn out from people that they don't feel afraid to express their love for geology and landscape anymore. They don't feel like an oddity because I've come out and said it with my chest. I love rocks, I love landscapes, and this is why. And I think coming with that, the lows are the vulnerability of sharing my own personal story, which is an incredibly intimate process to reveal how my husband left me and and the challenges I faced within the field of racism and misogyny. But through revealing that vulnerability, it connects the reader with the humanity that I am trying to express throughout the book. Because I think through revealing those kind of moments of harm that I've experienced, the reader can then relate to harm that has been done to people, particularly Indigenous people, over centuries, over thousands and thousands of years. So I think that alliance of my own vulnerability alongside those that have experienced even greater harm, I think it brings the book into a slightly different space. When I have those low moments, I think it is predominantly, grounded in, does anybody care about this book? Is anybody actually listening? Because I think as a new writer, you put your work out there, you're an unknown, no one knows who you are. And you're just wondering all the time, does anybody actually care? And I think you do see all of these kind of glitzy awards and these bestseller lists, and you think, should I would love to be on that. Of course I would. Every new author would love to be there, but you have to battle your inner demons because I don't necessarily have the connections or the subject matter that has a broad appeal, and I certainly don't have the race or the gender to push through those barriers to achieve that. I'm not saying that my ethnicity or my gender is holding me back. It's just that the publishing world is built on a certain system which favors certain voices. And as a woman of color, you have to be very, very resilient to understand that your work is just as good as others. It's just the system is working against you. So those are the low moments that I feel, if I'm being honest.
It's interesting you say that, because the book, it is a hefty tome. I'll be honest, like I couldn't just read it in one sitting. Maybe others were able to, but it took me quite a lot of time to process. And again, I'm not coming from a geography, geology, science background, but it was so valuable in its intent. But from what you're saying, the journey continues for you. So you've brought in this narrative around, your histories, around what you're working on, like exploring further the world in which you've inhabited for quite a long time. But what happens now beyond the pages?
Well, I'm not sure actually, because I'm still riding that wave of post-publication. We're about 3 or 4 months into the book being out in the public. And I think there are things that I would love to happen, and there are things that that I'm still trying to grasp. So if I go with the latter, I'm still coming to terms with how people are feeling after they read the book. And I've just had an email actually from a bookseller. He runs an independent bookshop, and he's just finished a book, and he said it was absolutely life-changing for him. He said that moment when he turned to the last page and it said, go out and, close the book and go and actually just look at the rocks. That's all you need to do. And he said it made him cry. When I get emails like that, when people are explaining the impact the book has had on them, that they never knew about this, that they'd never heard about these stories, that they'd never looked at the landscape in that way, that for me, as a writer, that is exactly what you want to hear from a reader. And to be honest, he was just like you. He's taken a couple of months to read the book, and it's taken a couple of months for those messages to land. And I think when I hear messages like that, I really want the Whispers of Rock to own its space on the bookshelf. So I'm not in any hurry to write, my next book, because I think the book is so epic in scale and tone and research and bringing forward all of these incredible stories and voices. I almost feel like it needs time to breathe and to own its space. I think what what I would like to do next is to pursue a more kind of broadcast version of the book. So that involves writing pitches for radio and TV. That's what I would love to do, if I'm being honest, because I'm a natural broadcaster. I've done a lot of presenting on television. And I think if the right person is listening to this out there and is interested in talking about a commission, that's what I'd like to do next. Bring the Whispers of Rock into a visual space where we are out there with the rocks and actually looking at them and connecting viewers with what the stories that they hold.
You never know. The audience is very wide and very varied and very global, actually, which is is why it's important to keep talking. You do have broadcast experience. You have a wealth of differing experiences. You also work in inclusion spaces. Is there anything you don't do?
Is there anything I don't do? I well, as you said, I'm a scientist, I'm a mother, I'm a wife, I'm an advocate for inclusion and diversity. I work for the National Trust as head of inclusion and belonging, and I'm a writer and a presenter. The things that I don't do is that I really try to look after myself in terms of how and when I engage with people. So what I won't do is I won't enter into kind of big spaces that drain my energy, because at the moment I'm on tour with the book and I really have to protect my energy and my time from being gobbled up. The other thing that I don't do, and I'm not ashamed to say this, is that I won't kind of tread into territories that don't align with my belief systems or my passions. So you won't find me going on to a program like Spring Watch and talking about birds or trees or the living aspects of the world, simply because A, I don't know about that, and B, because it doesn't generate a passion and a kind of enthusiasm within my heart. I love walking in nature. I love looking at trees and I enjoy looking at birds, but I'll be honest, they don't give me that same sense of fire in my belly like the rocks do. And I think that is something that, if I was going to talk to a commissioner or even think about a second book, I genuinely have to stay authentic to my own belief systems. The rocks, first and foremost, are my passion. And I guess I'm not this polymath that can spread into other aspects of the natural world and speak about that with integrity, because people would know that. And I'm a person that is, that has to be authentic and true to myself.
And that was the author of The Whispers of Rock, Dr Anjana Khatwa. Do you have an interdisciplinary life? Because I'd love to hear from you, and perhaps we can chat on this podcast that goes with my newsletter, which is called Have You Thought About? It can be found via www.jyotishshah.com. Please join me next time for a fun conversation with another guest who likes to mix up lots of things in their life. Do listen to past episodes and rate and review the podcast if you've enjoyed it. Thank you to Shah for the music.